Hello all and welcome to part 2 of my epic Legend of Zelda Retrospective, the show where I play through each and every single player Zelda game in an effort to find out how this great series as we know it came to be. Zelda II, The Adventure of Link is, as the title implies, a direct sequel to the original game, being released on the same console only about a year or so later. You play as the same hero Link, fighting off enemies with a sword and shield, wandering around Hyrule searching for monster-infested labyrinths to clear out, and building up your strength with heart containers and new skills in an effort to save the titular princess. The game is insanely difficult like its predecessor, even more so in fact with brutal enemy encounters, pitfall traps, and a very stingy 3-life system. But these are about where the similarities end. The fact is, the majority of Zelda II is largely unrecognizable from its predecessor, or any Zelda game to come afterward, earning it the unfortunate title of Series Black Sheep. But I know there's more to the game than that, and I'm ready to dive in and find out how Zelda II furthered the evolution of the series, how it handled its one-off changes, and how it holds up today. The most paramount change comes from the second you start the adventure. The game is a side-scroller. It seems like a pretty crazy shift for only the second Zelda game, but back then especially, Nintendo was keen on trying new ideas and seeing what worked. And side-scrolling Zelda can be great. There are plenty of 2D games out there that were inspired by Zelda, such as Castlevania Symphony of the Night. So in my opinion, a side-scrolling Zelda game is not inherently a problem. It's just a different feel and a different experience, just like how the first 3D Zelda game was a different feel and a different experience. So let's move past the initial shock and see what Zelda II can deliver. The most noteworthy of the many new mechanics that arise inherent to this style of gameplay is a dedicated jump button, which introduces platforming elements as well as new maneuverability during combat that contrasts with the stiffness of the original game. But with one button for sword and one for jump, you'll notice that there is no button left for items. That's because there aren't any conventional items. All of the items in this game are passive abilities, like lighting up caves or revealing invisible enemies. There are no bombs and no long-range items like the bow or boomerang to help combat the insanely tough enemies. Instead, you have to take everyone on with only your sword and your skill. Now, as anyone who knows the Zelda series could tell you, this would ultimately be a one-and-done change, and no other Zelda game would not feature bombs or other equipable items. Which is definitely for the better, but knowing this, I think having one game that focuses more on close-quarters combat is not that bad of a thing. Blocking melee attacks with your shield is a new feature that would become a staple of Zelda combat, and Link learns some new sword techniques like the up thrust, the down thrust. He can swing midair and while crouching and even shoot fire from his blade. So even though combat has greatly changed from the original game, it's still very fun with a decent amount of variety. As a replacement for items, Zelda II introduces magic spells for Link to cast that range from upping his defense to damaging enemies, or even restoring health. Using these spells depletes the brand new magic meter, a game changer that drastically alters the complexion of Zelda II. You not only have to think about how to approach enemies, but also how to approach mana consumption. There are no hearts in this game, so to manage health you'll have to rely on your shield and life spells, and all the while still keep track of the magic needed for other more situational spells. Every time a magic jar drops, if you're at full magic, it has to cross your mind to use a spell just so the jar is not wasted. And when a full magic replenish drops, it's a huge relief. There are also no rupees in this game. Instead, there are experience points, which Link gains from defeating enemies. After acquiring enough of these, you can spend them on one of 3 stat buffs to increase your attack power, defense, or mana efficiency. All 3 of these are extremely important, and if you want to finish the game, you'll want to max out all of them. But an element of strategy comes into play when you realize that you don't have to spend your experience points on the upgrade right in front of you. If you want, you can skip leveling up one stat and keep building to another level, if you so choose. But you run the risk of wasting experience points this way because if you game over, you lose all of the accrued experience, and you also have to consider that whatever level up you're skipping would undoubtedly be helpful in avoiding said game over. So it's kind of a fun risk-reward system if you choose to do so. And it gets even more complicated when you consider that every time you complete a dungeon, your experience completely fills to the next level up. So, if you can game plan and strategize to spend all of your experience points shortly before completing a dungeon, ideally right at the boss, you can maximize efficiency and be rewarded with thousands of experience points at once, which is insanely satisfying. Using this method, I was able to level up my attack stat way faster than what a typical playthrough would net, and this made the game easier and more fun overall. I even left the first palace after defeating the boss just to come back later to get 1800 experience points rather than 78. If you are smart about utilizing this, you will never once have to grind for experience in this game. Don't be the person that gets 78 experience from a crystal and then complains about grinding later. Zelda 2 demands a lot more strategy and a lot more patience than its predecessor, and this is further exacerbated by another important new mechanic, the 3 lives system. Getting a game over will start you back at the beginning of the game, which is a big problem in both the early game with exploring Death Mountain and the late game with navigating to the Great Palace. But the bigger problem is you lose all of your accrued experience points when you game over, which just sucks given how valuable it is. So to avoid game overs, you have to play much more patiently. You can't just go in guns a-blazing like in other Zelda games. You have to approach each situation as a threat. This makes every enemy encounter more stressful, which in turn makes every victory more satisfying. But on the other hand, it can also be very alienating. The Zelda series is widely loved, and a major reason for that is the approachability of the series. This, I think, is a major area where The Adventure of Link stumbles. In order to appreciate Zelda 2, you probably have to have some sort of prior appreciation of super difficult old-school NES games like Mega Man or Ninja Gaiden. And to me, this speaks negatively on the game's age. And even if you do approach each situation patiently and deliberately, and you have your experience strategy all mapped out or whatnot, the game is still relentlessly difficult. And here is what I would consider to be the first fundamental flaw in The Adventure of Link. For a game that punishes death so harshly, it is not entirely fair. There are one too many bullshit deaths via pitfalls, and even playing patiently, oftentimes something will just come from off screen to fuck your day up. Not all of the enemy encounters are fun to fight. Many times they can just be super annoying or downright ridiculous. Even the magic management that I was talking about earlier isn't entirely fair. Sometimes you'll need a certain spell to get past a room, and if you don't have enough magic, well, you're fucked. You can go backtrack and try to get a magic jar drop from enemies, but enemies don't actually respawn that often, and you might have to backtrack all the way out of the dungeon. But dying gives you a full heal, so sometimes you just gotta say fuck it and commit suicide. Later Zelda games would fix this. If you need something to clear an obstacle, the game will provide you with it, or at least give you the opportunity to prepare yourself better, such as potions you can bring to restore your magic, or warps that let you leave the dungeon to resupply. All this game offers you are extra lives, but these are one and done, so once you pick one up, you can never get it again. So usually if you find one, it's not even that great because you're better off leaving it and coming back before a more difficult section. This is not to say the entire game is unfair and out to get you. It's only a handful of times that it feels this way, because with how smoothly Link controls and how fluid the combat is, especially after learning the down thrust, usually if you're in a bad position you have no one to blame but yourself. Aw fuck, look at this. Oh jeez, I'm fucked. God damn it. No! Well, better load the restore point, there we go. Sometimes you can get into a groove and just finesse on enemy after enemy with ease, and it never stops being satisfying. In contrast to the rigidness of the original Legend of Zelda, the controls in Zelda 2 are a fantastic step forward and a huge part of the fun factor of the game. Another significant change from the first game is to the pacing. The original Zelda was extremely open-ended, resulting in a create-your-own-adventure kind of deal that would ensure a different experience for each player. But Zelda 2 introduces a considerable amount of structure into the equation. When you first start the game, you are limited to a small section of the overworld and must enter Dungeon 1 to progress. And then the rest of the game follows suit and opens up in sections, and for the most part you have to complete the dungeons in their intended order. This level of linearity would go on to become pretty much the standard for the series, as no Zelda game for the next 30 years would attempt to recapture the freedom of the original game. Usually though, a Zelda game is linear in service of the plot, as new events unfold as the game progresses. Adventure of Link doesn't have this. In fact, like the first game, it doesn't even have much plot to speak of at all. Instead, the linearity is definitely due to the level up system. You don't want to wander into a place you are clearly underleveled for and get your ass kicked. But even still, the game's pacing is very suspicious. The difficulty will spike at random intervals with a very out of whack curve. Some of the most frustrating enemies and situations are near the beginning of the game, and some of the later dungeons are easier than previous ones. And once again, you can reach the boss of a palace without having the means to defeat it. But one interesting change brought about by this new type of pacing is the introduction of short side quests that must be completed between dungeons. Usually in the case of Zelda 2, it's just simple fetch quests, but the foundation was laid for future Zelda games to introduce meaningful side quests between dungeons, which we will see start to come into play a lot more around the fourth game. The 7 dungeons in Zelda 2 are all basically the same as Zelda 1's, generic mazes with keys and locked doors but no real puzzles, except even simpler and easier to navigate. The challenge of the dungeons comes from enemy encounters, because the dungeons themselves are not cleverly designed at all. They are all surprisingly short and not that difficult to traverse, with no real secrets to speak of at all. Dead ends in these dungeons are just that, dead ends, so you have to just walk back where you came from. There's not particularly good level design. Perhaps most egregious is this part in the 5th palace, where you have to walk through a wall with no indication. Who the hell would think to just jump into a random fucking wall? Like, Zelda 1 is a bit more cryptic overall, but at least it's entirely solvable. This is just bullshit. There's also fake floors you can fall through, which is ugh. But that is to say nothing of the Great Palace. Even though you're finally given a respawn point here, this dungeon is an absolute gauntlet of bullshit. It's so huge and the enemies are so hard that you will probably be stuck here for hours and hours as you learn the path through it. But it's the only dungeon in the game that feels really cheap and never fun. Obviously, games in the 80s were designed to be more challenging to extend playtime. But nowadays it just makes the game feel aged. As a kid, I'm sure beating this game on NES was extremely satisfying, but as an adult, I'd definitely say play this dungeon with save states. Because you need to complete the dungeon so perfectly in order to get to Thunderbird with an extra life, because you need all your health and mana for Thunderbird, and the only realistic way to get full health and mana is by dying. Also, don't go in with anything less than maxed out stats. That was a huge mistake by me in this footage. And once again, you can make it all the way to Thunderbird without having the spell needed to defeat it. That's twice now that Zelda 2 has employed this garbage game design. And if Thunderbird wasn't enough, you have to fight possibly the hardest boss in Zelda history right afterward without healing. And yeah, there is a way to cheese this Darkling fight, but fuck that. After all these years, I'm gonna finally beat him legitly. Ha! Not bloody likely. I mean, I'm not gonna cheese him in the traditional sense, but I'm still gonna abuse my save state. There's no fucking way I'm going through this shit palace again every time I die. I couldn't imagine playing this normally and having to go through this whole thing again over and over every time you die at Darkling just to learn a little bit more about his pattern, if he even has one. Darkling took me something like 10 attempts, so if you pulled that off as a kid, you are God. The only good thing I can say about the Great Palace is that the music is good, even if it reminds me of Wart from Super Mario Bros. 2. The regular dungeon music, though, is kick-ass. The soundtrack overall, while slightly bigger than the first game, is worse, because none of the other songs are that great. I think the overworld music kinda sucks, but it's fitting because the overworld itself sucks too. The environments look really messy and ugly, it's not very fun to explore, there's way fewer secrets than in the first game, and this giant maze in the corner is ridiculous and makes this Hyrule look more like a video game than a believable place. But the overworld is not the main focus of the game, so it's something you just gotta look past. But for the first time in the series, we see areas that are neither dungeon nor overworld. There are long underground caverns and a handful of little villages scattered about. The townspeople bustle around as if they have lives of their own rather than just waiting around in bunkers, which helps bring Hyrule to life in ways the original game did not. But nothing brings Hyrule to life more than a compelling story, which, like its predecessor, Zelda 2 is sorely lacking. Once again, we're given 3 sentences in a title crawl to tell us what's going on, except it's even less interesting and relevant than the last game. After Link defeated Ganon at the end of Zelda 1, a sleeping spell was cast over Princess Zelda, and the only way to wake her is by finding the final piece of the Triforce that was absent from the last game, the Triforce of Courage. Meanwhile, Ganon's minions are out trying to kill Link and use his blood to resurrect Ganon. Of course, none of this makes a lick of sense, so once again we're going to have to locate the instruction book to find out what the hell's going on. As it turns out, despite being the same Link from the last game, it is not the same Zelda. This Zelda has been under a sleeping spell for generations. Her father, the King of Hyrule, is the one that locked her away, awaiting the one who bears the Triforce of Courage to come and save her. Sometime after defeating Ganon, the mark of the Triforce had appeared on Link's hand, signaling to Impa that Link was the one destined to win the Triforce of Courage and awaken the ancient princess. And Link's quest, one to visit the 6 palaces and place crystals to open the Great Palace, is nothing more than a trial for him to prove his worth. The old man who gives him the Triforce has probably been waiting in that palace for like 200 years. Look at this poor shriveled bastard. What a fucking trooper. Link is able to use the United Triforce to finally wake the sleeping princess. He is once again crowned the hero of Hyrule, and that whole resurrecting Ganon thing is just kind of forgotten about, I guess. There are some redeeming elements to the story. It's neat seeing some ancient history of Hyrule for the first time, and it's great seeing the full Triforce together at last. But other than that, it's not much of a story still. Certainly not enough to get invested in, and also not really significant in the Zelda universe. Both Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 are kind of out there on a random branch of the Zelda tree, largely inconsequential, neither contributing anything of much importance to the overall lore that would come to be established. And inconsequential seems to be the word that defines the adventure of Link. As a Zelda fan, you're not missing much by skipping this one. It doesn't feel much like a Zelda game at all, and it's missing a lot of the most wonderful aspects of the series. The Black Sheep is a fitting title for the game. It comes off as alienating and a bit soulless. But don't let the fact that it's not a great Zelda game make you think that I don't recommend The Adventure of Link. Oh, quite the contrary. I think it's an amazingly fun game at times, challenging and extremely rewarding. The controls are great, the combat is intense, dungeon music is awesome, and a handful of Zelda staples are introduced, including towns, caves, magic spells, and side quests between dungeons. But the greatest thing about Zelda 2, in my opinion, is the new level of strategy brought on by the magic meter and the experience point system. You have to approach the game from a certain mindset to enjoy it. It coaxes you into a patient and cerebral kind of playstyle, and if you resist that and you don't adapt, you're going to hate it and put it down rather quickly. It's easy to go on and on with gripes about how Zelda 2 is worse than most other Zelda games, but what's good in this game is really good, and if you go in with the right mindset, there is a ton of enjoyment to be found. These types of flaws are not what define the game, and the way in which Zelda 2 compels you to use both your brain as well as your skill makes it a truly underrated gem in my opinion. I'd say keep all this in mind and give it another shot. You might be surprised. But next time, we're going back to classic Zelda formula and a game that would forever revolutionize the series. I am so looking forward to this one.